when I was coding for a company and I was making code and there would be problems in the code, bugs, right? And then my boss would come in and he'll change my code. And I'm thinking, what is happening to the creativity that I have put into it?
Most people who have studied AI and theology has read about AI. Alexander Chow has actually studied it before he became a theologian. Last week, he launched the Oxford Handbook of Digital Theology, the most comprehensive reference on the field. How does someone who knows computer science and theology respond to the challenges of AI? Welcome, Alice.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you studied computer science before studying theology. Why did you change your field?
I studied computer science and worked for about a decade as a software engineer. But increasingly, I was also interested in theology. And so I decided to transition to theology.
Since you have been trained in computer science, will it heighten your awareness of AI's promise or its challenges?
We were learning about AI techniques and the underworkings of how AI works several decades ago before ChatGPT or Claude or any of that came out. So a lot of that has really informed my perspective on AI technologies.
You have just co-edited the book, the Oxford Handbook of Digital Theology. Why did you do that?
Digital theology has been a growing field for maybe the last decade or so in terms of how people think about digital technology from a theological perspective. And it has grown exponentially, especially after COVID-19, the pandemic, and then the advancements of generative AI. So we started to think about editing it in the 2019, 2020, and really started doing it in 2021.
And when you were gathering resources and inviting people, were there significant gaps that you think that needs to be filled for this handbook?
I think with the advancements of digital technology through social media and then later on with things like metaverse and then generative AI, there were increasingly lots of questions that were coming up. Lots of them were people reacting to these technologies. So oftentimes it's theologians or Christian practitioners who are reacting to digital technology, but there was not as much people just sitting back and thinking and reflecting on what these technologies are doing and how to respond to them, and also how some of the basic theological doctrines and theological ethics should take into account the digital.
What are some of the earlier topics that people work on compared to what you just said, universe and other things?
Probably the earliest works were thinking about how people were getting online in internet forums, and people were reflecting on what does that mean to be a church? Can we be a church on an internet forum? Can we be a community that way? It was also looking at the digitization of the Bible. And so when people start to read the Bible on their computers, on the web, and then eventually on their mobile phones and the like, what does that do to our engagement with the Bible? And then the other major thing in the late 90s into the early 2000s was the growing of the internet, right? And in particular, Wikipedia, Facebook, and all these new social media platforms were beginning to be engaged. Is the internet really a force for democracy, as some people say? So these were a lot of the early discussions about digital theology.
And current issues will include AI, robotics, and transhumanism, and what else?
There's also discussions around surveillance, for instance. And surveillance, of course, has multiple forms. It's not only a government that is observing us, but also many of us have smart watches or smart doorbell that has types of surveillance in itself, surveilling how our heart is running, who drops off packages and stuff. But of course, there's also other topics, how different types of ministries are operating online. So questions of how do we run a church? How we have preaching online? What does the digital media provide in terms of missions or evangelism or social justice issues?
I am interested in how theology can be a resource to address some of those AI issues. You have written a chapter creation. Can you use that as an example how theology may be a resource?
That chapter on creation, in many ways, was one of the earliest kinds of thinking for myself personally. When I was a software engineer, oftentimes I was thinking, I'm writing code and hey, I'm creating. Look at these beautiful things I'm creating. And there's already, from a very basic level, there's a sense in which I am creating like possibly God is creating. So this question of creativity. But then what I realized when I was coding for a company and I was making code and there would be problems in the code, bugs, right? And then my boss would come in and he'll change my code. And I'm thinking, what is happening to the creativity that I have put into it? It's being changed or it's not as perfect as I think it can be. And mindful of that kind of a background, when I was writing this chapter about creation, you realize that a lot of the people who reflect theologically about creation talk about how we are made in the image of a creator God. That means that we reflect some of those creative tendencies. Oftentimes, the teachings around creation is about God creating out of nothing. But actually, when you're a programmer or you're doing something on social media, on Instagram or whatever, you're creating using different sources. So you're not creating out of nothing, but you're creating out of something. And so that for me, writing that chapter helped me to think about some of the questions around creation, but also a lot of the focus is really on us as the creators. So what does that mean? So the theologians often talk about humans as co-creators with God. And so how we as humans work in concert with God. But also, and I think one of the areas of theological reflection that I add to that chapter is what does it mean to create something that kind of has this life of its own? You think about things that you put out on social media, on Instagram or whatever, and you think, oh, all my friends will love this. But actually, when you put it out, some people will love it, other people will hate it, other people will react in different ways. And it has a life of its own. And what does that mean? That does it actually have a kind of life, a kind of way of engaging or growing in its own ways? So these were some of the things that I was thinking about when I was writing that chapter on creation was the creativity, but also the goodness and the fallenness, if you will, of what is being created, and also how we are to do things in concert with God as co-creators with God.
But some people will say, why do we need God? Now we have these powerful AI and futuristic
Mhm.
machines. They can be just quasi-God, if not praying God already.
Yeah, I would say that part of that comes out of human pride, the sense that we can create things that are so great that are able to create on their own. And there's lots of literature that's come out recently. AI is seen as a kind of deity of sorts, but ultimately, I think from a Christian theological perspective, I would always insist that there is still God is still greater than all that exists, including that which we are able to create. And surely AI is not just taking my data that I put into it, but it's taking the collective data of so many different people and around the globe and so much more than just the people who are just alive right now, but trying to build a huge database, a learning model of all these different things. It seems to be omniscient. It seems to know everything, but does it really? And there's limits to what it knows and what it can do in actual fact.
You are also a scholar of Chinese Christianity. In
Mhm.
China, you have the very ambitious growth of AI, as well
Mhm.
as a growing population of Christians. When you look
Mhm.
at these two together, did you see something that is interesting or challenging?
China is advancing so quickly in the development of digital technology. And oftentimes it's because the Chinese government does not want to just use Western technologies. In particular, it's creating, there's government sponsored creation of their own ChatGPT equivalents, their own kind of AI engines. And so there's this huge push to create their own generative AI for their citizens to use. And as such, that actually insists on, in some sense, the power of the government coming through that technology. But also, all AI is biased because humans are biased. And it is explicitly biased towards the Chinese government because of what is being allowed and not allowed to be engaged with. Related to that is China for a very long time has had a very sophisticated surveillance technology within what we call the Great Firewall of China. This thing that doesn't allow certain things in, but also is able to do facial recognition and what they call a social credit system, a way of assessing how people perform or live in society and how they contribute or hurt what the government's aspirations are. This reality that the government is trying to create their own technologies and advancements, as well as the surveillance emphasis, these two aspects, I think, have some challenges for Christians living in China. The surveillance is very obvious that even though you're being surveilled, how do you negotiate that if you want to have a faith that is expressed in meetings or in society in some way? And so the government is trying to emphasize its hand on this, but Christians are responding. And some are just ignoring and accepting the surveillance, while others are saying, we're going to try to work around it. I think for Christians, whether in China or outside, there's not really too much reflection on what does that mean in terms of how it affects our societies, our environment, the environmental costs around this, the ethical questions around AI. I don't see that theologically being reflected too much within churches. It's not a simple, is it good or is it bad? But it's much more complex and requires us to really reflect, what are we doing when we're using AI?
You have written on Chinese public theology. Do you think that we need to have something like a global public theology to address issues like AI, robotics, new technology that affects the whole humanity?
I think so. A lot of theology in general and public theology specifically is very westernized. And that's because that's where a lot of the literature is coming out. And a lot of frameworks have historically been present for a very long time. You have the epistemological frame, the way that people think is very much shaped by Western ways of thinking, but also the contextual questions that are raised are very much raised within Western society. So what we're asking from a public theology, that is a theology that engages public and common concerns in society, it needs to take into account the wider world and not just the Western world. Maybe I'll give you a quick example of this. Oftentimes we talk about the digital divide. So that's those who have digital haves and digital have-nots. And I think oftentimes in Western society, there's a sense, well, we need to have lots of advanced technologies and all sorts of things because it makes things more efficient. But yet at the same time, many people are wanting to have digital fasts in a Western society because we've been inundated with so much social media and stuff. We need to take a break. Let's take a break on a Sunday. Let's not use our phones for Lent. But that's actually a very different question when you go to different contexts around the globe. That actually in certain societies, you'll have people who have mobile phones before they have actively clean running water. And the infrastructures in their societies are not as built around that we see as basic needs. Yet they will feel that there needs to be access through a mobile phone. So there's contextual differences in different parts of the world, but also ways of thinking that are different in the world as well. Different priorities that are placed around what technology gives us. It's kind of funny, if you look at movies coming from in the West, you often see these ideas of the future with AI taking over the world, and it's like apocalypse. It's like the worst of the worst that's coming out there. But actually, if you look at a lot of films that come out from Asia around AI and digital technologies, actually, those are utopian futures. And that is partly because of the different perceptions of the material world, of the world around us. How do we engage the world around us? Is it so bad to have things around us that have a life of their own? And so I think going back to your original question, global public theology, yes, we need to have a public theology that engages the ways of thinking and the contexts around the globe, because that informs a bigger sense of what humanity is about and what the common good of humanity is all should be concerned about.
When you say that different contexts may respond to AI and new technologies differently. For example, the Buddhist, the Daoist, and the Confucian may have a different understanding of human beings that will be
Yeah.
very different from what we understand to be Imago Dei, the image of God. The Daoist thinks that human beings can change on a constant basis, that they may not be suspicious of transhumanism or something that human beings will change and evolve. Can you address that? Since in your Chinese public theology book, you talk about the very deep substratum of Confucianism affecting Chinese theology.
In different societies, especially in Asia, and if you think of Taoist, Buddhist, and Shinto ways of thinking, there is an appreciation of what is generally perceived as inanimate. Within Western perspective, we say this is inanimate, but actually there's something, Christians would say that there's something sacramental, there's something enchanted, there's some spiritual value, or God is working through these immaterial things in different ways. But within these different worldviews, like you're saying, there is a different appreciation of what is human, what it means to be sentient. For a Buddhist to think about sentience, for instance, the ability to sense. This is probably why you have the creation of Buddhist monks and Shinto priests. Robots were being designed for decades now, whereas only recently there's been beginning to have possibilities of people thinking, oh, can we have a Protestant or a Catholic priest? What does that mean to have that? Within the Western theological frame, we can't think about that as actually being, that's not really a priest that is blessing us or giving a sacrament. That's impossible. So within the Western frame, we don't have that. As you say in my book, I talk about Confucianism. And I think one of the major themes that is within Confucianism, but also East Asian religions in general, is this notion of 天人合一, heaven and humanity in unity. And it's this idea that humans and the heaven, whatever we understand heaven to be, is working in concert together. For my book on Chinese public theology, I use Confucianism and I use this idea of heaven and humanity in unity as a way to say that humans are working in concert with God, as is often understood as heaven. God and humanity is working together for the greater good. And actually, in my chapter on creation for the Oxford Handbook of Digital Theology, I take that and I expand that even more and say, so it's not just about us working with God, but it's us working with the rest of creation, that we are working in concert together for the greater good. And that includes digital technologies. We create things with digital technologies, and there can be good that comes out of it. And so we should work in concert with that, but also recognizing that it's not all good, that there's a lot of AI hallucination and algorithmic bias and all this stuff comes out of the fallenness or the imperfections of humanity. And yet, even with that, all of us can work together with God to bring about things that are ultimately glorious to God and good for this world.
In this sense, the study of world Christianity can contribute a lot. Just like what you said, Chinese theology might contribute a very important perspective that we might have missed. Or African Christianity can look at AI and new technologies in a different way. And do you think that the field of world Christianity has paid some attention to this?
I think the field of world Christianity has increasingly paid attention to it, but it has not done enough of it. And I think vice versa, the field of digital theology has paid attention that we do need to have global voices, but it struggles to get those voices into the conversation. It's the Oxford Handbook of Digital Theology. I tried to get actually a lot of contributors from different parts of the world. And the reality was it was much harder to do that because there were much fewer people who were reflecting on these things from their different contexts.
Alice, given your rich experience learning about computer science and very fluent in both Western and Chinese theology, what do you see in the next 15 years theology might look like? Ask AI to write it for us?
Probably not. So I am a theologian. I am not a prophet. My biggest concern about AI technology, and any technology for that matter, is that we often look at technologies as tools. And even if you think about Pope Leo's Encyclical, he gives the two metaphors of the Tower of Babel and rebuilding of the wall to the city. And what are those two images? They're images of humans using technologies to create. So what are they creating? And I think oftentimes that is the focus that we have with technology. Technology is something that we use to create, but we don't critically reflect on it. And that, I think, is hugely worrying when we don't. Not only are there different ethical questions around how we use it and what it's dependent upon, but also we forget the biases that are magnified by the technologies like generative AI. This is why when I teach, I tell students, I don't think it's wise for you to use AI to find all your source material. So a lot of people will use Claude to find different references on a given topic. I'm like, you can, but you need to think about it. You need to go beyond just what it finds. Because why? Especially when I'm working in world Christianity, what you're going to get is going to be very biased. The LLMs behind Claude and ChatGPT are built on only the data that they have access to, some of which they've gotten illegally. They're limited by the data that they have. But actually, what world Christianity and other fields like this are trying to do is saying, actually, there's a lot more that is out there than what you can easily find and what everybody else references. My concern in the next 50 years or so is that it will lead to people who, in some ways, are more dependent on technologies and are less critically reflective and therefore also increasingly more biased. This is what we have with the rise of social media that creates all these echo chambers. And this is why if you're on X or formerly Twitter, or you're on Instagram, or you're on Truth Social, or whatever social media you're on, it actually magnifies certain types of things that you encounter. And it increasingly magnifies those biases without helping you to really think and really wrestle with what you've been fed. So I think maybe that's a little bit of doom and gloom. We've advanced in many ways in medicine and in education, but I do think that there needs to be some caution in terms of how we engage it. Because what it ultimately is doing is just creating a new culture, a new worldview in how we see the world around us.
How do you see Pope's Encyclical? Do you think that statements like that would be helpful?
When the Pope says something, it hits the news. And he is one of these figures that lots of people will pay attention to. The Vatican has actually put out a lot of documentation around digital technology, around 3 decades now. And that's one of the largest churches in the world and one of the ones that have produced the most reflecting on it. Do I agree with everything in there? No. But I think that actually for the Pope to have the encyclical and also to have the co-founder of Anthropic there with him is a wonderful thing, because I think that actually highlights his willingness and his desire to be in conversation, as well as to give a magisterial kind of a statement. I do think there are some shortcomings in what he has to say. His encyclical, in many ways, is very human-centric in its focus. It's about magnifica humanitas, the magnificence of humanity. And so in many ways, it forgets about all of the rest of creation that's impacted by humanity and humanity's pursuits in digital technology, as well as it forgets about the magnificence of God, right? And so I think the focus on humanity is great, and the social justice pleas of the encyclical are wonderful, and the challenge between the power of corporations versus the building of a civilization of good and love, I think those are brilliant and wonderful to have a pope write that and release it with the co-founder of Anthropic. But I would like to see that go farther than just that. It's definitely wonderful to have the encyclical because it has really pointed out how the church needs to pay attention to this. And I hope that other denominations and church or Christian bodies do similar types of things and maybe bring out distinctives from other traditions as well.
Thank you very much for speaking with me. And we certainly learned a lot from your unique experience, both as a computer science and also a theologian. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.